everybody, and good evening. My name is Jim Ryan. I'm the Associate Director at the Kevorkian Center here at NYU. And it's a real pleasure tonight to have all of you here, as well as our speakers who will be introduced in a moment, and to be partnering with the Century Foundation on what I think is going to be a really fantastic event. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about what we do here at Kivo, if you're not already familiar. We are a Title VI National Resource Center, which means that even though we're housed here at NYU, our mission is to serve the Middle East studies, the purveyance of Middle East studies here on campus and out into the community and in the public. We run over 70 academic and public events here in the Kevorkian Center throughout the year. So if you guys Google us and find our website, we hope to see you out here at events in the future. I just wanted to thank a few people for helping put this together. I already thanked the Century Foundation, but at TCF, Thanasi, Mariel, Rohan, who's actually an alum of the Kevorkian Center's master's program and new to TCF. Mohammed Bazi brought this event to us, and we're really, really glad that he did. And with that, I wanted to wish you guys a nice evening, and that you join us upstairs for some wine and refreshments after the event. And I'd like to introduce, on behalf of TCF, President Mark Zuckerman. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, and it's great to see so many of you. I can tell the panel is just so excited that they have a full house for this discussion. Jim, thank you. Thanks to the Kevorkian Center. Century is celebrating its 100th anniversary, and we are doubling down, part of that celebration, on a work to promote peace and security in the Middle East. I want to thank the Luce Foundation for their support of this event and our project Minorities, Citizenship, and Inclusion in the Middle East. I want to acknowledge and thank the Carnegie Foundation for their continued support of our Middle East work, and thank our partners here at NYU. I also want to acknowledge the leaders of our Middle East team, Michael Hanna and Thanasi Cabanas, and many thanks to our expert panel tonight for coming, each of whom are participating as a working group member for the Luce project that will be happening tomorrow and Friday. Finally, we produce many great reports at tcf.org. If you sign up for that newsletter, you get free reports, timely analysis of what's happening in the Middle East. I hope that you'll sign up for that. And now I'd like to turn over the proceedings to Thanasi as a moderator for tonight's panel. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Mark, for your support, and Jim, thanks for hosting us here at your center. We're really excited about this project. It's capping off the first year of work. This is a Luce Foundation-funded inquiry into citizenship, minority rights, and inclusion in the Middle East. And it's a question that is unfortunately timelier today than it was when we first framed the question, because a lot of the issues that we felt were live in the Middle East are unfortunately live as well in the United States and Europe today, where questions about pluralism and coexistence and polarization increasingly sound like the questions that we've been asking about the countries that we work on and study in the Middle East. So I'm going to try and keep this panel very tight. We're going to have about 45 minutes of discussion up here among ourselves, and then we're going to turn it over to audience questions. I will ruthlessly keep you guys to 3 minutes in your remarks, because I know when I'm in the audience, I do not really, I'm not able to pay attention after about 3 minutes of one voice. So projecting from my own limitations.
I can do voices if you like.
Okay, Carl, you'll get nine minutes. So tonight we're asking the question: does secularism have a future in the Middle East? And there might be some differences on the panel about what people actually mean by secularism. I start with a very simple, minimal working definition where secularism simply means a system where the government does not abridge religious conduct, and where the government is not based on a single religion, and where personal status doesn't stem from someone's membership in a religious group. you are free in your remarks to elaborate on a different approach. We're also interested in the context of citizenship at a time also where Middle Eastern governments especially have either narrowed their definition of what citizenship means or have engaged in a kind of systematic rights stripping and unfortunately, again, similar processes are at work in many Western states. So let me quickly introduce the panelists, and then I'm just going to start in with questions to them. To my immediate left is Rabab al-Mahdi, a political scientist at the American University of Cairo, who also helped spearhead a ambitious, if unsuccessful, secular Islamist alliance in the Egyptian presidential elections of 2012. To her left is Carl Sharo, the architect and social critic, best known not for his life's work, but for his lunch break tweets, as Carl remarks. And to his left is Elizabeth Thompson, an intellectual historian at the American, at American University. I got that right. And her work has shed a lot of light on the history of popular movements and democratic movements in the Middle East. And finally, Mustafa Akyol, a Turkish writer and scholar who has been a signal and rare voice for secularism in a context of Islamic history, and he'll have probably more clarity to say about how he defines himself in the context of what we're talking about. So let's start by looking for a clear understanding of the problem. The debate that's been underway for a long time in the Middle East over secularism often starts with questions over whether secularism is even an indigenous concept or a Western imposed inauthentic construct. And it's often tied up with discussions over failures of governance. So Rabab, I want you to start with some context for us. How do you diagnose the gap between governments and the governed, between populations that have very diverse identities and often self-identify along a whole spectrum from secular to pious, and states that design rights and legal structures often entirely on a religious basis and assign rights on those terms? How much do religion, and specifically Islamism, define what kind of rights citizens have?
I think the key concept here, the key word, is rights. I don't think that we have rights. So accordingly, I don't think that it's about secularism or the lack thereof. It's actually about the lack of rights. Those governments have continued to define not just the rights, but to define who is the citizenship, who is the citizen, and accordingly citizenship. So in Egypt, for example, you're a citizen if you are Sunni, male of a particular age, heterosexual, supportive of the regime, or preferably apolitical, right? Everyone else, tends not to have that set of rights. So I think it's not about the lack of secularism or its existence. Now, when you look at the social engineering that happens, basically, once you start defining who is the citizen, you start defining who is outside those boundaries. And the boundaries are not just legalistic. I mean, let's be clear, to assume that the idea of religion and rights being defined by religion is just that of governments or states is, I think, not very accurate. Because within society, you have a majority that actually believes that rights should be defined based on particular religions. Now, I don't think that this is something to do with the cultural per se, but I think that this has everything to do with the social engineering. Those are societies that, with the creation of the state, citizenship and accordingly the societies were created to be defined in a way where secularism is not, I wouldn't say not indigenous, but is not something that we grapple with.
So where do rights come from? I mean, do they come from religion directly? Do they come from civil religious authorities? Do they come from non-government groupings?
Not at all. I mean, when you look at even governments that supposedly have the same religious reference, which is Sunni Islam, you'll find that they define the rights very differently. And basically, and this is why I'm saying it's not because of secularism or the lack thereof. It's basically what's convenient for the regime in power. So once we define what's Islam, for example, we define it according to what would be the political narrative that we want Muslims to abide by, and accordingly, what would be the rights that we would like for them to have or not to have.
So, Carl, when you look around the Middle East today, do you see secularism playing a role anywhere? And how does secularism or secularity, whatever your preferred term is going to be, in the way people live their actual lives, relate to the way they're governed?
Yeah, before I do that, I'm going to do one of my pet things, which is always attack the West. Which is, there's 3 or 4 people who know about. It's basically, I think we're living in a universal crisis of secularism, and trying to understand that within the Middle East context on its own isn't very productive, because we can't isolate it from the international intellectual currents that have kind of led to the decline very broadly of the intellectual roots of what we term to be secularism and the Enlightenment and humanism. And those are a product of multiple factors, but one of which is a sustained academic attack against the very foundations of those ideas that emanates from Western institutions of learning, and a kind of a rejection of those in practice within the West. And what we're seeing today is almost like a parody of that within the Middle Eastern context, with its own particularities. Now, that kind of takes a sharp turn from 2011 onwards with the so-called Arab uprisings, in that we kind of accentuate this duality of secular versus Islamist. And then those become the kind of the two competing forces. And in reality, neither of these are operative and complete in their own terms. So there's struggles within Islamism with multiple strands to define what political form it could take, or what supra-political form in some instances it takes, that takes the form of the rejection of all established institutions. Whereas within secularism, we see this kind of retrenchment towards a position at its kind of lowest common denominator is we're not Islamists. And this is not a very helpful position to be in. And what's making the situation worse is, I think, again, this strand of a decline of universalist ideas. You know, if you look at this, for example, empirically, you look at how successful liberal and communist and leftist Arab parties across the Middle East, they've been in decline for decades. And that's part of a general trend in this kind of failure, what I term the failure of modernity, that tends to fuel this decline in the idea of secularism. So what's left of it is kind of an empty shell. It's this idea that allows, and I'll come back to that later, certain regimes to say, we actually represent secularism today. But it's almost like an empty shell. It doesn't have the spirit and the kind of the bold ideas that would drive secularism. It doesn't have a foothold within society and a vision that people seriously aspire to.
And I think we're gonna touch a bunch of times on the sort of political avatars of secularism. But I just want to ask you a quick follow-up. The way people live their lives. So before we depart into high politics in countries like Lebanon and Iraq, which countries you know well. Is it fair to see the populations as being much more mixed, secular, non-sectarian, or more than sectarian, and completely not represented by these very ossified religious and sectarian political orders that supposedly represent them?
another way of putting it is there's on the social level, there's more dynamism, although it doesn't always manifest itself in a political form. In places like Lebanon and islands of Iraq and Syria and Egypt and other places, there's kind of these islands where secularism in lived experience. So you look at something, for example, which empirically could be established in the post-civil war in Lebanon. The neighborhoods that emerged there became again more mixed with Christians and Muslims. There's kind of an increase of that, and you've experienced that as when you lived in Beirut. Whereas if you go back to the civil war years, there was a kind of much more radical separation. Now, for that to work on a day-to-day level, there's a system of managing difference, right? That doesn't mean that I have to be an atheist necessarily, but I could be, and I can kind of mediate all these differences in a way that the state is not able to manage. But it also lives in a more important place, and I think that's probably it's more manifest in Lebanon than any other Middle Eastern country at the moment. It lives in the political imagination as a high ideal, whereas in other places it's seen as this kind of the idea of secularism is a corrupt, authoritarian, externally imposed ideal. When you look at grassroots movements in Lebanon, they still aspire. Even a lot of them who don't actually buy into it necessarily in practice, they still kind of use the language of aspiring to a universal secularism as the kind of the binding glue that would generate political movements. So that means it still has a resonance and it still has a hold on the political imagination. Not only in Lebanon, you can see that as well, if you talk, to certain sections in Iraq or in other countries, it still survives at that level. And the interesting thing is to understand why does it have that resonance still.
Elizabeth, you've done a lot of work that's cast light on the deep indigenous history of various popular democratic and secular movements around the Middle East. When did secularism reach its peak as a authentic or popular idea? And was it ever a potent force? And if it vanished, when did it vanish?
Oh boy, you rolled all three questions
3
you
minutes.
gave me into 3 minutes. I'll start with a critique of the picture you picked. Many elements in that picture speak to the demise of secularism over the course of the 20th century, partly due to an imposition of secularism by dictatorship under Nasser, partly due to a kind of popular Islamism that was born as a reaction to the disruption of vernacular politics. And here, I'm going to speak very narrowly because only 2 weeks ago I turned in a book manuscript, so forgive me. I'm not reading newspapers, but I'm going to give you a little bit of history. The peak of secularism, according to my manifesto, was in 1920. All right, it is a moment in which the project of the late Ottoman period to build a civil state bore fruit in Damascus in 1920 under a Congress that was elected that and saw as its president the leading Islamic reformer of the day, Rashid Rida. And Rashid Rida stood up at numerous times in the very public debates over the articles of that constitution to argue, first, oh, no, we cannot make Islamic law the source of all legislation in our state because all of our people are not Muslim. So compromise, we'll make the king Muslim, all right? There's no established Islam as established religion, Islam as a state religion in 1920 in Syria, all right? These are people who have suffered through World War I. They're trying to put Humpty Dumpty back on the wall and finish what they saw as the project of the 1908 constitutional revolution in the Ottoman Empire, all right? Then he's confronted with a debate on women's suffrage. One side, nice sheikh from Gaza, a very Western-looking guy, says, Islamic law says women should have the vote. His opponent stands up from Hamas and says, no, no, no. Cites his reasons why Islamic law says women should not have the vote. Rashid Rida is the mediator who holds together a Congress that includes Islamists, and this is the important part of the story, okay, and includes the people who would really rather have a republic at this point, all right? And he says, you know what, you're both wrong. This is not a question for Islamic law. And argues, and he has a status to do so because he is an Islamist in the room as they're writing the Constitution to say there are limits to the jurisdiction of Islamic law. And this lies outside of that. There is a whole realm of public interest that the legislature has to address. And so he advocated a very narrow and modest form of Islam in the form of, well, it's got to be the king. Why should the king be Muslim? Well, there's a population out there that's used to having a sultan who's also a caliph. And you know what? They'll look at this state and they'll say it is a kafir state, it's an infidel state. Not practical. Third point, pragmatism. Pragmatism, populism, and the inclusion of Muslims and Islamists, if you will, in the process is the key that led Syrians to a point to ratifying a constitution that created a civic state, and that's in that constitution. There's not a word about Islamic law. What happens to that state? The French come in and occupy the country, okay? In fact, the French captured a copy of that constitution. They have justified their occupation because they must protect non-Muslims from evil Muslims who go around killing Christians. Remember, the Armenian genocide has just occurred, right? They change Article 1 of the Constitution in the French translation to read that Islam is the religion of the state, not religion of the king. A key change and an error that is replicated by scholars like Majid Khadouri, who becomes the expert in mid-20th century on the history of constitutions and claims that Muslims have never sought a civic secular state. They had. The second below, which I'll take my second 3 minutes for, is that in the wake of colonization and the betrayal, the expulsion of Arabs and Muslims from the family of civilized nations after 1919, they really did, as Aris Manella has told us, believe that Woodrow Wilson intended that Muslims and Arabs would get their own states and be part of that family of nations, right? That is where we see the genesis of an explicitly anti-liberal Islamism, not with Rashid Rida, not with the sort of predominant thinking of the day in 1920. And in response, as you know, to the rise of Islamism, we get Nasser. And secularism imposed from above, whether it be in Turkey or in Egypt, never had legs and the popular in the street. So 2011 brought those popular forces of both on the religious side and on the on the Muslim side and on the non-Muslim side to life again. But people in 2011 never knew the story of Rashid Rida in 1920. Thank you.
It's a sad story of an experiment that almost was and wasn't, and instead we got as the singular avatar of secularism in the Middle East, the Kemalist experiment in Turkey. So Mustafa, tell us what conclusions, in 3 minutes, you would have us draw from the experiment with imposing secularism from above that Kemal Ataturk gave us.
Sure. These French, they messed up everything. I'm kidding. Well, first of all, I should say one thing. What do we want to achieve? What I want to achieve in the Middle East? What is the goal? What's the label for it? For me, it's not a secular Middle East necessarily. It's a liberal Middle East. Even more important than democratic, because you can have democracy as tyranny of the majority. So a liberal Middle East where rights are protected from governments, protected from authoritarian groups, communities, terror groups, all of that. I mean, how can we have a more liberal Middle East? I think that's the global key question. And how can we have a more liberal world too? But we're speaking about the Middle East now. Now, secularism is certainly a key element in establishing a more liberal order. But what kind of secularism is very important here? And as someone coming from Turkey, I can say, well, there are good kinds of secularism and bad kinds of secularism. To explain that, I should just go back to the founding of the Turkish Republic. Why secularism was introduced in Turkey? First of all, we don't call it Almania, or we don't call it separation of church and state. In Turkey, we call it laik. As you
the
can
Fre-
see, it's
from the
come
French.
from the French. Yeah, it's the same word, exact same word. It's written in the Turkish constitution. Turkey is laïque, right? So,
Which I think comes from the Greek word for the people, laos, right?
really, okay, well, okay, I'm not gonna get in there, but
Just the Greeks, you
Yeah.
know, it's like, obviously it's
well,
Phoenician.
everything comes from there. Yeah.
We got this from Wikipedia.
Yeah.
We got this from Wikipedia.
Everybody has a basis here. Now, why was laïclique was introduced? I mean, you look at. I would love to have a laïclique with the idea that every citizen is equal and we should have a citizenship that is not defined by religion, which was already there in the Ottoman Empire. I mean, the Ottoman Empire in the Tanzimat period introduced the fez, so everybody can wear it regardless of their religion, so they can be all Ottomans regardless of religion and race, which was written in the Ottoman Constitution of 1876. So there was some nice secularity evolving, which I think, as you said, influenced some better angels in the Arab world as well. Religion was defined by a certain group in the Ottoman Empire as obstacle to progress. And these people believe that religion is passé, it will vanish, it has to vanish. Science will give us all the answers anyway. And because of religion, we are backwards. We have to push religion out of the public square. We have to minimize the force of religion as much as we can, so we will be a more progressed French nation, right? That was the whole Kemalist ideal. And with that philosophical, approach, secularism turned into an authoritarian idea in Turkey. And the biggest manifestation of that, which we probably all know, was banning the headscarf. You could not wear a headscarf and enter the campus. And I, for decades, well, I'm not that old, but at least 2 decades, fought against this, saying that this is illiberal. They have the right to wear a headscarf or a miniskirt, whatever they want. It's individuals. I mean, so in Turkey, that's why when you go back to 10 years ago, there were the Islamist conservatives which wanted to wear the headscarf but didn't talk too much about gay rights or other things, right? They wanted their thing. And there were the secularists who wanted to ban the headscarf, and it was such a big thing that coups were made over not allowing the headscarf to enter the public square. And there were the liberals who were saying, but then wear what they want. So liberalism was a different line. So, and that's why I think the Turkish experience, the Kemalist Turkish experience, and the Reza Shah in Iran, which actually copied that and made it even much worse. I mean, banned women from wearing the headscarf. That kind of thing gave secularism a bad name. I think for secularism to have appeal to a broadly religious society, you should make 2 things clear. You're not bringing secularism because religion is bad, because it's an obstacle to progress and it is medieval dogma and science will explain everything. Not that. You're bringing secularism because it's good for religion itself too. If there's a secular state, religion will not be a tool of tyranny or will not be a tool of conflict. Because when you say Islam is the religion, Islam is the state religion, whose Islam is it? Who defines it? Which Islamic group? Which sect? Among Sunnis, is it the Hanafis or Shia, or the modernists? Or is it the Shia? I mean, it's endless dispute there. So we are making this, taking religion out of this, and it's better for religion. And that argument has been made in Turkey in the past 2 decades. And I see Turkey's conservative Muslims saying, okay, that makes sense. I mean, if secularism means my headscarf will not be banned, I'll be able to be an equal citizen as a conservative, pious Muslim, but others will be able to live in the way they want. And by the way, thanks to secularism, maybe we will not have endless battles over who's the best righteous Muslim. I mean, that I think is a more appealing thing. In Turkey, in the past few years, we have a growing authoritarian, politics. Not outright Islamist. It's more based on a cult of personality, like Kemalism was around the current president. And some of the now more thinking, let's say, religious conservatives in Turkey are saying that. And of course, this authoritarianism in Turkey using a lot of religious rhetoric. They're saying, oh, maybe this was what secularism was good for. So we wouldn't have this kind of nonsense. I mean, so I think it's important to explain. And therefore, I believe in particular the American experience of secularism and the philosophy behind that I think, is important to explain, at least to share. Because it always came from laïque, which came as freedom from religion, but never of religion. Secularism as freedom of religion as well is, I think, a very important thing to share. to explain.
Well, and this leads to the question I wanted to ask Rabab, which is why is it that religious minorities and secularists have ended up historically being so closely aligned with authoritarians? And why has the bargain over and over again been that a leader like Sisi or Nasser or the Saudis, you know, hilariously, except it's not funny, can fashion themselves as defenders of pluralism and secularism and minority rights when in fact they aren't supporters of anybody's rights?
Fashion themselves internally or externally, because I think those overlap, but for different, there are different reasons. So externally, simply because it's easy and sexy and fits preconceived notions about the region, right? This is a region that speaks, you know, this strange language. They're Muslims. Get us someone who can actually protect us from the immigrants or let them not kill each other. So, I mean,
but
it's
within the societies we're talking about,
within.
whether we're talking about the legions of Egyptians who welcome Sisi or people in Syria who will say with a straight face that Assad is the best defender of diversity in the face of a takfiri.
Of course. I mean, those people have the money and the power not only to create the narrative of protection, but actually to create their enemies. If you look at the Syrian situation, for example, I mean, those people going around killing are actually going around in SUVs carrying Saudi, Qatari, and Emirati plates. Right? Who gave them the money to get all those weapons? I mean, we create. I'm not going to go back to Afghanistan and the Mujahideen and the
sometimes
Americans
the United States
and
has
whatnot.
as well,
exactly.
Right?
This is why. I mean,
awkward.
This is why I mentioned the Afghanistan situation. So they create the enemies. You give those supposedly crazy people. I mean, who funded the Salafis? Whether all the way from books. To weapons in, books in Egypt, weapons in Syria. It was the Saudis who are now being, portrayed as actually the liberators and protecting us from the actually more extremist Muslims. So, and then the idea of the social engineering, the idea that there is a better version Muslim and a better version dictator. So a dictator that actually does not necessarily have a beard or carry the weapons against all of us might be able to protect some of us. And again, this is fed by historical incidences that Elizabeth was talking about. So, I mean, there is a grain of truth, but that grain of truth at the end of the day actually ends up when someone has the monopoly over this kind of power. You can easily pit one faction against the other and claim to
Okay, so let me
it.
ask a more direct question. Is Bashar al-Assad an effective defender of secularism, and is Abdel Fattah al-Sisi an effective promoter of minority rights and coexistence?
Of course not. I mean, both are actually the reason why they're enemies. If you look at the start of the Syrian revolution and how it ended, I mean, this is the doing of Bashar and the Saudis, right? If you look at where Egypt is now, even under the very short period of the Muslim Brotherhood, it wasn't such a dictatorship. So, no, I mean, those people actually tend to fashion it in a way where they come across as the protectors. And because we do not have a space for civil society, for people to actually meet each other. I mean, I've had friends, Egyptian friends, who are like, oh my God, the Salafis, it was the first time for them to actually see Salafis after 2011. Because everything was kept under a very tight lid. What we actually need for those people not to be protectors is exactly what will take them out of power, which is a space that would allow people to talk to each other, but also to talk about issues of sectarianism that exists in our societies.
So, Carl, to what extent, I mean, you've argued both a little bit here tonight and in things you've written that at least I've read, that what's happening in the Middle East with the erosion of rights is part of a global trend, and it's not a uniquely Arab or uniquely MENA crisis. Can you parse that a bit and tell us, to what extent this is a global problem, and to what extent the crisis and pathology of rights stripping in the Middle East has uniquely Arab or Middle Eastern elements to it?
Yeah, I was thinking specifically of that when Mustafa, in his eloquent kind of introduction, when you talked about the US model of secularism, and I can see the benefits of that, but I was also thinking, but actually it's also at an impasse in its ability to regulate the role of the majority religion within the affairs of the state, which begets you all the culture wars that you guys know about more than me. And it is at that model, it is at an impasse there. Now, why is that the issue, though? Why is it at an impasse? And this is what I term, in 3 minutes, I can no way do it justice, but I'm going to try to attempt to, is we live in a world that kind of post the culturalist turn, right? The destruction and not complete destruction, but the kind of reduction of the role of the big political ideas and aspirations that drove the world for now 2 centuries is towards this kind of more divisive, fragmentary, culturalist prism of looking at what the body politic is constituted of, the identitarian, I promised myself I shouldn't try to say that because I can't really say it, turn that kind of posits those categories that are not universal. They're not defined in terms of class, they're not defined in terms of ideology, they're much more defined in terms of innate individual characteristics, is a commonality across both MENA and WENA, Western Europe and North America. Incidentally, it's a branch of inquiry that I've started that's beginning to be taken more seriously in universities across the world now. This commonality is, I think, what we kind of tend to miss by kind of fragmenting this divisiveness on us. Okay, let's look at how things are happening in the West and how things are happening in the Middle East. But actually, the commonalities are there to see. This fragmentation comes from the position of the reinvention of historical categories or cultural categories that weren't politically operative until very recently. I'll give you a very clear example. The idea of being politically a Shia, in the sense that Hezbollah describes itself today, would have been almost completely alien in the 60s. I witnessed the birth of this in Lebanon from the 80s onwards, right? And you look at similar categories in the West, and you realize 50 years ago, they wouldn't exist in the same way. So in a sense, when we look at the idea of Islamism, for example, it's not about the historic continuity. This is a reinvention of how your relationship to religion under the new paradigm, in the absence of these big universalist political ideas, operate. And what that makes you do is obsess about minutiae of your relationship, social and political relationship to other people, rather than place the contestation, the big political contestation of how we organize society and how we organize our states and how we organize the relationship of the individual to the state at the center of politics. And this is what I'm trying to say is the commonality now that's kind of eroding this. It's not a golden age, but a healthier way of trying to do politics, and it manifests itself in different ways in MENA and in the West, in the Middle East and in the West, but that have a lot of similarities. But without a shadow of a doubt, there's a crisis for secularism in both.
Elizabeth, do you have any other or additional thoughts about what aspects of this crisis of secularism is unique to the Middle East? And do you have any sense, and I think you told me beforehand that you don't, of where there are still vibrant advocates for this idea today?
There are still very vibrant advocates, that's true. Many of the people who were in the Syrian coalition in 2011, 2012, 2013, they were mixed. There were people who came from religious backgrounds or people who came from secular backgrounds, and they were working together. I think it's alive in places, and at times we see it in places like Iraq as well, believe it or not, despite all the forces that want to divide Iraqis according to groups of, these new groups, which, makes me think of, think along the lines of what would it take to roll back or, to redefine, raise consciousness that you were living with a historically created political cleavage that pits your Islam against non-religion or against liberal secularists and elites. Obviously we don't go around educating people in school about raising their consciousness and so on. That's hard to do. But one thing to do to roll back, for example, is to roll back to where does the Islamism come from? It comes from the denial of rights at a very seminal moment, 100 years ago. Right? A denial of self-governance, a denial of dignity as human beings. Syrians had created their own government and had been told, unlike others who had allied with the Allies in World War I, they were not going to rule themselves. It comes with the denial of social justice, right? And if we go back, it didn't die in one moment. And there were intriguing moments, and I'll take the year 1950 as one, a moment of democratic transition in Turkey, right? Where a more religiously inclined party, well-intentioned at first, not so much later, I understand, comes, actually gets elected. 1950 is a moment in Syria where a constitution is adopted that includes social rights for the first time, except, whoops, slipped behind the back of the of those who saw themselves on the left were the heirs of 1920 and the Islamists who slipped in for the first time in a constitution. Islam must be a source of law. That's the first one in an Arab constitution, right? But also look in 1950 and in 1950s in Iraq. And under the guise of communism, you saw most people who marched for the communists in 1958 and 59 in the wake of the coup, right, thought they were marching for a liberal constitutional state. That was the public face of the Communist Party in Iraq, right? And there was a moment in April 1959 when 1 million people marched through Baghdad in support of that, thinking that Qasem, the dictator, who is under tremendous pressure, and I'll get to my second half of my answer in a minute, and will not be able politically to open his arms to a popular base for his regime, okay? They believe, that movement includes Kurds, Sunnis, Shi'is, right? Christians, right? The founder of the Communist Party was a Christian from Basra, right? And the leadership of that party had rotated, right? The party did not involve a denial of Islam, right? They learned early on that that was a mistake. It didn't work so well. Tactically, they set that aside, right? But the elephant in the room all through those 1950s was the Cold War. And the kinds of politics from the outside that preempt the very messy and very tenuous transition toward a more democratic, liberal, and hence possibly civic, if not secular state, right? Qasem, of course, is afraid, is getting pressure from Nasser and certainly the United States. In Syria, the same thing happens. A left-leaning but democratic government in the mid-1950s is going to be crushed by a threat, first an American attempted coup from Iraq, and then a NATO threat from the north, and they will throw their arms themselves into the arms of Nasser, who will crush every last remnant of democratic politics in Syria by 1961, right? And then we have in Turkey as well a military fueled under Cold War conditions by NATO dollars, right? And an economic crisis that leads to, and I'll leave it to you, Mustafa, about what goes wrong at that moment. But we lose the outside pressures of the 1950s reinforced the elite liberal secular against Islamic democratic divide.
So this is an unending mystery to me, because we're in a context where terrible ideas rammed down people's throats by authoritarians seem to catch fire all the time. And yet when we talk about secularism in the Middle East, and then we look in specifically at Tunisia and Turkey, we always end up saying, well, the problem was this guy was a dictator. He never got mass public support for his idea, even though for 3 generations, 4 generations, like leak was the law of the land. As soon as he was gone, the whole thing was only skin deep and disappeared. How can that be? I mean, is there somehow a greater affinity for Islamism? So as soon as some slightly authoritarian person opens the gates of Islamism, everyone loves it and it's genuine. But when the same thing is coming for the sort of secular approach to rights and governance, it doesn't take. Why not? Or why?
Well, so, I mean, first of all, I would like to come to your initial question, why, like, Christians in Syria prefer Assad to the Syrian opposition, which include a lot of Islamic elements. Because people like Assad, they don't care whether you're Christian or Arab, I mean, of Muslim. They care whether you're pro-Assad or not. If you're pro-Assad, you're wonderful. If you're not, they will torture you, kill you, and your family as well. So the same thing with, I mean, Mohammed bin Salman, as we're seeing these days. So their issues do support me or not. So they are ecumenical whereas Islamists come with a certain, yes, ideology and religious ideology. And the fact that secularism doesn't progress that much, yes, has something to do with the fact that although we have people like Rashid Rida or in Tunisia, Ghannouchi, who are embracing secular or civil state with some reformist arguments in Islam. Yes, there is a traditional interpretation of Islam which thinks the state should serve religion and non-Muslims cannot be equal. So that is there. Or apostasy is a crime, or blasphemy is a crime that should be punished. So, I mean, the transformation of Islam with towards a more liberal future is a must, a necessity. Maybe it's happening in Tunisia right now. There are some bright, signals from Tunisia. The economy is bad, but, the political scene is better. In Turkey, we also should see, and I think that's what we see in Turkey, there is also a whole sociological dimension to it. Islamism is generally accepted by people who are not the traditional city elite, but who are coming from more rural backgrounds, and who are either still rural or newly urban. And the elite, has adopted the more cosmopolitan or, ways. That is very much the Turkish politics. I mean, Istanbul was a city of 1 million people in 1950. It is a city of 14 million people now. And the people who are still that 1 million who play the piano and know the French wine, they hate President Erdogan and his party, and they vote for CHP, the Kemalist party. But then you had 13 million newcomers who think that these people look down upon them, which is true. These people oppress them, which is true. And now saying, now we have it. Now it's our turn. And so is this a story of Islamism? Yes. Not explicitly Islamism in Turkey, but a lot of Islamist political sentiments, morphed into Erdoganism, what I call. It's also like a sociological thing. And 50 years ago, these people didn't have political power. They were in their modest villages. And there's that social transformation, which even explains, right of religious right in Israel. Newcomers from Russia, the Ashkenazi elite. So there is a social dimension to it. The question will be, though, how do we contain the authoritarian ambitions of Islamism, and how do we recast secularism as not the ideologies of this guy and the secular tyrants in the Middle East, but a framework, civil. That's why the civil states, the Medaniya, that's I think a promising concept. And we should have some models. Tunisia is the only model right now that we can all look up to as this is something working well. And for that, I think recasting secularism as a framework rather than the tool of a secular elite on the majority is, I think, key. And that is the key even in Turkey.
Well, Rabab, you said eloquently a minute ago that we need a space where people can even talk about sectarian issues, which are real, but sort of free from sectarian governance. How does one come to that? How does one, for example, get to a place where you don't have to be Muslim to be the president of Egypt, or you don't have to agitate for rights as a member of the Christian minority, but you could simply agitate for rights as an Egyptian with civic rights?
I think the first thing is not to obsess about the legalistic issues. I understand that it's important what the Constitution stipulates, but in many constitutions across the region, there are actually a lot of rights. A lot of rights for women, for people from minorities, but none of that is actually respected in practice. And again, even in states that are secular, the idea of a Catholic president in some places might not be something that's very common, or a female president, right? So this actually comes with a lot of struggle. And the problem is that we do not have that space to build for those struggles so that this becomes an option. So one of the things, for example, that Elizabeth was talking about is the top-down sectarianism, which actually gave sectarianism a bad name. So once the debate becomes about, do we take religion out of the public sphere, the first thing that you look at, who's saying this? And again, who's saying this and to what purpose? And those are people that you do not either know, relate to, or actually completely distrust where they're coming from, in the sense of this idea of civic engagement, that we actually do not know, of discourses, of indigenous discourses, of groups who are allowed to work on those issues and create those spaces, let alone to create this as a viable option. So in certain cases, in the case of Lebanon, for example, or in the case of Egypt, even if you had, a woman of a particular religion run, well, it's not just that she will not be allowed to run. Will she be voted into office? No, she won't. And what does that actually, where does that come from? That no one else, whether it's a woman, it's a man, or only Sisi will be voted to office, right? So it's not just the issue of lack of secularism, but the lack of a space actually that would allow for the existence of rights, whether those rights are for people of, religious minorities or women or whatnot.
So Carl, in the two countries I think you know best, Iraq and Lebanon, which are often held up as the strongest engines that remain of universalism, or at least an intellectual class that supports these ideas. Does anyone actually overtly oppose religion in public life? Does anyone actually stand up and say, I am a secularist, or I believe I'm religious personally, but I think religion has been destructive and awful for our political life and should be out? Is that a position anyone can take and not be killed or drummed out of public life?
No, there's shades, but I think there's a commonality that Elizabeth alluded to in both the Lebanese Communist Party and the Iraqi Communist Party. They realized early on they sort of couldn't overstep the mark. So they sort of tried to represent Marx as a sort of later prophet of Islam, and he kind of had a beard and all of that, and he kind of fit in, right? And they never confronted Islam head-on in that sense, in the way that you had the Jacobean impulse in France and other European countries to kind of address the church head-on, although admittedly the historic circumstances are different, because the church in France is much more complicit in the very structure of the state in a way that you couldn't say religious institutions, Islamic institutions weren't necessarily set up, particularly in the Levant, to kind of concentrate that form of power. So that meant the necessity for confronting them wasn't necessarily there. But I still personally maintain it's not, I've spoken kind of in the past about, in both places, what I used to take optimism from in the past, and kind of it's almost like a precedent. It's not necessarily this putting it in the sense of I hate religion, I'm going to take it out of public life and all of that. But it's the ability of people from different sects and religions to actually insult each other. And that was brilliant, right? Because when you were able to do that, that meant there was a space for this playful antagonism of everyday life. Yeah. So I could, during the Civil War, I could, as a Christian, joke with my Muslim friends. I'm not going to repeat the jokes, but we could kind of compare certain traits of Jesus and Muhammad, and we'd be all kind of open, to debating these. And then I realized as the war went on, and actually after the end of the war, we stopped being able to do that. That means the kind of that enforced politeness meant that we become much more protective of these things, right? And I think it's this disappearance of the spontaneity of, at a playful level. I'm not saying it has to be in the sense of let's go burn a church tomorrow in the old Jacobean tradition. That kind of removes the friction. The problem that we end up with today, and you see the replication of that in every single group in the Middle East, is the deference is actually a mark of disrespect, right? We're trying to shrink wrap people's beliefs and kind of protect them from this intrusion of being questioned or being interrogated in any kind of serious manner. And I feel like that's a very stifling force. And that's kind of the challenge that we need today, aside from all kind of solving all the constitutional questions around this, is how do you reawaken this sense of almost convivial rudeness towards each other's beliefs that kind of could spark off some sort of... I'm half joking.
You've certainly done more than one person's contribution to that effort.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, have there been any examples...
Can I plug the book on
of the reverse? So we hear so many tales of the end of comedy or the end of some kind of secular-like or civic, government that falls into some kind of sectarian fragmentation. Do we have examples of the reverse process of a sort of emergence of something universal from a fragmented polity, or of something that is more civic from the the sort of ashes of a more sectarian order?
Well, you know better than I that at particular moments that has emerged, whether it's Tahrir Square or the very first revolts in Syria, people did step out of their normal roles, right? The question that I confront as a historian right now, since I work a lot on World War I, and is what do we do about societies that are suffering from mass trauma? Many times people return to kin and religion in times of trauma, and particularly at a time when your state can't do anything, right? There has been no Marshall Plan for, there will be none for Syrians, right? One statistic I heard was, there were 4 million housing families in Syria in 2010. They're half that now. There's no place to go home, right, for people there, and the people in exile are largely of one sect and not others, right? What do you do? I don't know that in the midst of the kind of trauma that we're seeing in post-war or continuing war Iraq and in Syria and now in Lebanon with the influx of the refugees, whether it is a time that is ripe. That's, I think, foolish to overlook the social context and the social need. What I would propose, looking back, however, is a common story. If you think, I'm always haunted by the first real big book by Said Qutb on social justice in Islam. And if you read that book, it would sound a lot like what the socialists of that day were saying, right? What people are hurting, and the place and the space that you might create is the space where you salve the pain, and whether that, that can be the communal space where they're all human. But that doesn't happen in a place like Lebanon, where only the rich get to rebuild their houses, right? Or take place under the heavy repression going on and the very poor economy in Egypt. Right? Now you don't even have the Muslim Brothers out there providing the social care. And I don't know. I haven't been back to Egypt, and I'd love to know. Are there those places where people are picking up the pieces?
You wouldn't be allowed to ask, I think, if you went.
No.
Mustafa, is there a religious argument to be made using Islamist terms for the separation of religion from government?
Yep. First of all, 2 points. I mean, Sayyid Qutb got more.
You still only have 3 minutes.
Great. So 1 minute for that. Sayyid Qutb got more radical in prison under torture.
Yes.
So we should, just one example, we should see that. I mean, there are dictators in the Middle East like Abdul Fattah al-Sisi and his forerunners and Bashar Assad, and these people say, we are protecting you from the Islamists, we're torturing them nicely, and so on and so forth. Well, they are making the Islamists more radical. They are making jihadists out of Islamists because of their own tyranny. So they should not be given this blank check, by Western governments thinking that they're fighting terrorism. They're creating terrorists by their torture chambers. We have Islamic communists in Turkey as well, who think Marx is the last Muslim prophet. I mean, they're heretical, I think, because Adam Smith was the last Muslim prophet. Because there's Islamic capitalism too. You can make anything you want, from a tradition. Well, there is an Islamic argument for a secular state. It was actually made in Egypt in 1920. Razik, he made the first, and also by Said Bey in the Turkish parliament, I should say. They made the same argument at the same time. They both argued that the caliphate, which gives Muslim the historical idea that there should be a state defined by Islam, right? He said the caliphate is a historical institution. It's not a religious institution. It just happened to exist, but we're not obliged to have caliphate. And he was, of course, condemned and so on and so forth. But that argument is out there, by liberal, progressive, secularist Muslim, if you say, saying that Islam appeals to the individual and the community, but it doesn't say anything about a state. Read the Quran, you don't hear any definition of a state. Prophet Muhammad said, in his farewell sermon, he said, I'm leaving you the Quran. Sunnis think Quran and Sunnah, and the Shia think the Quran and Ahl Bayt. So everybody has their own version. But he didn't say, I'm leaving you this beautiful state that I created. He happened to be heading a state in Medina because historical circumstances pushed him into that, but it was not his mission or legislative vision. That's that argument there, and that is, I think, that is the Islamic argument for secularity, not religion is an obstacle to progress that we should eradicate, which unfortunately has been a religious, secular argument for a decade, for a century. It's that, you should recast religion as something that is compatible with and that's good for religion.
Well, now we're going to turn to the audience for questions. Are we doing mics for the questions or just speak up loud? Speak up loud. Okay, so I wanted to...
Could you repeat?
Yeah, I'll repeat all the questions into the mic so we can have them on the tape. I'm going to take questions in batches of 3, and I will ask you to say your name and say your question. And I hate to do this, but I will. If you don't ask a question in your first sentence, I'm just going to thank you and move on to the next questioner because we want to get questions, not speeches from the floor. So let's have a couple of questions.
Hi, my name is Mike. Is it not a case that the more that you try and push religion out of public life, whether that's constitutionally or by force, the more attractive and legitimate you make religious actors as an opposition?
Thank you. Rawia, did I see your hand?
Yes. When you talk about Tunisia essentially being the model or the hope, it was literally the one state that was coming to my mind as all of you discussed the different options or countries that we have at the moment. And Rabab spoke about or you've asked Rabab repeatedly about what space could people come together. When we compare why Tunisia worked and other places didn't, or trying to work, perhaps the presence of unions and trade unions there. So as long as we continue seeing the destruction of public space in places like Egypt where there's zero opportunity for people to come together, is there a possibility to break out of the cycle and see a Tunisian model? Because the question then presents itself, what would that public space be? Is that a possibility if we don't have that?
We're all looking to Rabab to solve that.
What do I know?
Thank you. My name is Irina. My question is for Mr. Akil. What is the reaction of Erdogan and his party to your ideas about liberalism as opposed to secularism, given the crackdown that we've heard about in terms of the Gulen movement, also Islamists? We haven't heard as much about this discussion of liberal ideas. Why is that? What can you tell us about it?
Okay. Thank you. So to restate the questions through the mic, we had the first question was if the more you push religion from public life, do you not make religion the only real viable opposition? Rawia asked about what possibilities there are for a Tunisia-style model where you have public space and unions and other vehicles for civic engagement. And finally, Irina asked about what is the reaction of the Turkish ruling party to ideas of liberalism. And I would add to that, actually, when you answer, I'd love to know whether you think at this point laiklik is really a meaningful part of the ruling party's agenda, or whether they're only willing incidentally to let it survive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we can start from your end and just move
right,
up this way.
Right. First of all, the first question, yes, that's true. I mean, the more you push religion out, the more it comes back. But I think the solution is if religion, or the religious people, understand that it is better if they don't dominate the public square, but just appear in it, even better for them. I think there you can have it. Otherwise, it becomes a culture war, ultimately. Then they want to come back, and that's what's happening. That's what in most parts of the world. I'll just focus and then on the third. I mean, civil society is key. Of course, when you crush civil society, what's left there? There's a tyranny of the state, and the mosque as the opposition, which is what we have had in Egypt for a long time. And yes, Tunisia is successful partly because its civil society is robust, and you have the quartet and different labor unions and other organizations which allowed a space between the government and other actors and different parties and so on and so forth. What is happening in Turkey Erdogan loved the liberals in his first decade because the power still was at the hands of the Kemalists. And the liberals were arguing that there should be no military coup, and elected people should run the government. And Erdogan saw light in the European Union, and liberals supported that. So there's a big Erdogan AKP, let's say, not Erdogan's persona, but ruling party, and the liberals were in love for a long time. And I was one of those, useful idiots, if you will. I mean, in 2012, a key member of the ruling party said, "We have been in cooperation with liberals for a long time because we were deconstructing the old system. Now we will construct a new system, and maybe we will not be together that much anymore," or something like that. That was really a great prophecy, and he put it very clearly. So we said, wow, like these guys are really now getting into business for something else. And then the ruling party started to move away from all these liberal ideas that it gave to lip service. And I think what happened was, first, they didn't have state power. The state power was really at the hands of the secular bureaucracy, but that's judiciary and military. Once they captured that, they didn't need those wishy-washy ideas anymore. They didn't need that there should be a limited government. Why limited? We have it now, right? So there has been this incredible Machiavellianism. And of course, not everybody in the ruling party agreed with this. Some of them said, no, we shouldn't do this. We opposed this for 10 years. And they found themselves sidelined. That includes the very founder of the party, Abdullah Gül. Erdogan and him had founded the party together. Today, Gül is totally out. Some AKP hawks call him a traitor because he just remained true to the founding principles of the party. And the party became a new Leviathan, but is this, what about secularism? I mean, basically it's a kind of a Ibn Khaldunian cycle of, if you know that, like conquerors turning into what they conquered. And it was a Machiavellian thing.
We heard for years and years in the Arab world that the Turks had created the model that we were all going to learn from,
we messed it up
Islamic democracy.
We had 15 minutes of fame. It looked really good for a while, and now it's just, it's not great. Like, look up to Tunisia, not us. secularism today, interestingly though,
I think it's overrated.
Turkey's
but
secularists
it's a different story.
opposed Erdogan fiercely for the first 10 years for the wrong reasons. They opposed AKP people because their wives wear a headscarf and they have mustache and they are too conservative. I mean, they were obsessed with the fact that the first lady would wear a headscarf. That was almost bringing the country to a coup. That was the wrong reason to oppose the AKP. And ultimately, the secularists realized that that obsessive secularism doesn't help them. Now the military is gone. Now the judiciary is gone. They have to win elections, something they never tried in their history. So they gave up on this excessive secularism obsession, which is good for them. But still, things don't change that very easily. And secularism is not an issue in Turkey today. Look at Turkey's discussions. There are now legitimate criticisms to the government, Erdogan and AKP. Things like there's very little press freedom, very little rule of law. There is one-man rule, and a lot of authoritarianism criticisms, which are 90% legitimate, not 100%, because I'll come to details there if you want. But and secularism is not an issue because the AKP people got what they wanted from secularism. Okay, you can wear the headscarf, you can be anywhere. So I think Turkey will go like this for quite a while. Secularism will be not an issue. However, I also see some, in the AKP universe, some more dogmatic Islamists who are saying, well, actually, why don't we go more? I mean, since we got it, the secularism thing is a foreign imposition on us. Mustafa Kemal was a Zionist conspiracy, Kemalism, that all kind of nonsense. And so why don't we go back, actually? I mean, there is a kind of Islamist Tea Party, if you will, working on the AKP. I don't know how much effect they will have, but that shows that, I think the Turkish experience shows that many conservative pious Muslims are fine with a secularism that is liberal and respectful to religion. But still, you would have Islamists who are saying, still, people are drinking freely and that's sinful and that's not, that's corrupting our youth and we shouldn't allow that. So there is that edge too. We should see that, even in Turkey.
And secularists seem to be more concerned about the freedom to drink alcohol often than, say, the freedom, from police torture. Or,
yeah, I mean, now they got everything is important, but secularism actually now, secularists now like the liberals because they're not empowered. The liberals are just liked by people who are in the opposition in Turkey, and they're crushed by the people who are in power.
Rabab, do you want to take the Tunisia space labor union question?
I mean, I pushed for the idea of space in this discussion, so my answer, Rawia, is no. I don't think that you can actually have this. What we're talking about really is a redefinition of citizenship and the enlargement of the space of rights and who is entitled to do what, not just legalistically in a constitution that's not upheld, but actually in terms of societal practices and the governments that are there. And those things anywhere in the world, not just in the Middle East, anywhere from the French model of secularism to the American model of secularism. I mean, this did not come because someone stayed in a room, thought of, what is the best way to have, the kind of society that will be respectful to all. It came through struggles, a lot of bloodshed, and people just, going against each other in debates, forming and whatnot. We've had the bloodshed part. Now, we've never had the space actually to hold those debates and to have, which is, again, we've seen a glimpse of that with the Arab uprisings, but everything was cut short. And I mean, I won't delve into the Tunisian experience. I think there's a lot of, things that we also need to engage with critically. But I understand where this is looked at, or why it would be looked at as an example. But again, ironing out those kinds of issues, amongst societies, and again, to be reflected in legal documents, anywhere from laws to the Constitution, cannot happen without that space. And as long as there's no space, no, we will not have those rights. We will not be able to bring them. And the whole idea, actually, of not allowing the space is to uphold the question that you were asking about, the protector, that one person or one regime that actually fends off the Muslims from the Shiites, from the Christians and whatnot. And the idea of space actually takes away, destroys the need for the single protector, so to speak. So it's a vicious cycle.
Can we get a few more questions? The lady right there in front of Mike, you, yes.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Two questions. You can choose whatever one you want to address. The first one is for Carl. In 2011, the Lebanese, more or less communist, leftist people tried to launch this Islamic, which in their experimentation is to dismantle the sectarian regime, and it failed horribly. So their experimentation with secularism and to define it, in your opinion, why did they fail? And is it primarily kind of not knowing what secularism is to them and to the Lebanese experience? And my second question targets that. We were talking about defining secularism, and I think that's the point of, like, I'm still confused and trying to define it in terms of the Middle East experience. If we can go across, or whoever wants to tackle it, in the Middle East, I don't think we can kind of talk about in lay experience, because that in itself isn't necessarily the most exemplary form of secularism. So what does it mean for you in the example of the Middle East?
Gentleman in the back row.
Oh, you're in the back.
You.
If the discussion about secularism, if the violence occurred under the secular government, therefore the question really is not what the secularism is, what is that, but rather what's the condition of possibility of violence in these countries. What I mean by this, but the universals which applies to the singulars and try to exclude them and so forth. In the cultural realm, actually the Islam is one of them that is bespoke. So Quran is another one. Quran actually is a conditional possibility of violence in these countries which dominates Islamic dominance. What I mean by this, the Quran as a text never became as a text. Those who tried to interpret Quran as a text which everyone could interpret according to what they wish, which noted and so forth in the Western societies. So
can you wrap it up? Sorry.
Yeah, but the question is, Islam is speaking of Islam and so forth. But then all the reformers which try to interpret Islam as a text, actually they have escaped under these regimes. One of them lied in and died and so forth.
You, yes.
Oh. Hi, my name is Ansha. And I don't know who would like to answer this question, but I would like to ask a question about the other big elephant in the room, which is Iran. Considering being an Islamist regime, based on my experience, Iranian society is actually way more secular than some others that I know by person. So how actually do you interpret this? And what type of a role you're actually seeing for Iran in the greater Middle East?
Thanks. And Joseph, you're going to ask a really succinct question?
Thank you very much, sir. First, I just wanted to ask all of you, don't you think that the key issue is not singularizing secularism, but taking it into a global political program? Because the height, I think, of secularism was in the 50s and 60s, secularist ideas, because it was part of a larger movement into being, social justice, anti-imperialism, democracy, etc. And one of the key failures since 2011, and I would say even before with Turkey, is that they haven't been able to suggest a single pole. They have been divided between liberals that choose to, conservative and Islamic fundamentalist groups, or choose with the authoritarian regimes. Don't you think this is the key issue? And just for one thing, in Iraq, in the past few years, in the main square of Baghdad, they were chanting Almani, 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 secularism, because it was, people were protesting not only on a, if you want, religious ideas, but on a global idea, democracy, social justice, and anti-sectarianism. So I think this is a key issue to put forward. And after I would challenge the fact that any kind of these regimes were secular. Very far from it. Even Turkey, since its beginning, were never really truly secular.
Well, let us take these questions all together, and let's do it like rat-tat-tat, super efficiently. To quickly restate, there was a question about about the movement, a secularist movement that failed in Lebanon and why, how we define secularism. There was a question that I honestly didn't really understand about the Quran and violence under secular governments. There was a question about Iran and the Islamist regime with the secular population, and for extra points you used the phrase elephant in the room. And last, I encourage you all to agree with Joseph and his contention that it's time to bring secularism back into a sort of global context and think about it as an issue rather than as an area studies question. And let us start with you, Rabab.
I'll just briefly actually comment on the Iranian model. I mean, I think this is an excellent example when you look at the Saudi versus the Iranian model, both claiming to be religious, but both offering actually under that claim a very different sets of rights. And again, even though I'm not a big fan of either, I would definitely concur with you that, you know, under the Iranian model, you know, women and, you know, some people of different convictions actually have much more space than under the Saudi model. And again, here I go back to the idea of the political model and how it came about. And despite the fact that the Iranian regime is a religious regime, it was born from a mass movement and a revolutionary moment. And hence the rights, the set of rights and the construction of citizenship had to live up to this moment that it was born out of. Whereas the Saudis, being the creation of particular circumstances in the region at the time, and the oil and whatnot, again, were born, even though equally religious, supposedly, but gave very different sets, or did not give actually, the sets of rights the Iranians put forward. And hence the point is, how do, not just what the regimes bring to the table, and hence my disagreement with you on focusing on, you know, heads of states being in the constitution referred to as of a certain religion, but actually how the sets of rights, whether you want to call it secularism, I want to call it citizenship, is actually brought about.
Carl?
Yeah, I think the problem of the project for kind of the failure of the sectarian system, which was kind of analytically was a wrong way to describe what the issue is and then to try to rectify it, because you had a very tiny group of people who, starting from the notion that, you know, that persisted with Arab elites, not only Lebanese elites, is that the masses are ignorant, and once you kind of bring something to their attention, their eyes will open and everything will be fine. And that doesn't work in practice. What we need is genuine grassroots movements across the Arab world and across the Middle East. Those are what are going to be able in time to transform the nature of a system like the Lebanese system. So I'm personally very skeptical of notions like treating rights or citizenship or secularism as policy questions. For me, they're matters of politics. There is no universal kind of template for what secularism means. For me, as a Marxist, secularism means something different to Mustafa as a liberal, right? But it's in the contestation of what we want it to be for our kind of common political space. We need to define it through these political categories. But we don't do that today. That's precisely the problem, or where we end up being, is we tend to treat these things as kind of abstract, almost constitutional and legalistic and almost like reform aims, rather than the subject matter of politics itself. And you go back, and Elizabeth gave several examples, you know, from historically. You look at particularly phenomenal, the history of the Iraqi Communist Party, and it manages to kind of build a large popular support around very progressive ideals, around anti-imperialist positions, through this kind of grassroots work. That's how you do it. And I feel the real problem today which kind of negates why I'm sitting in this room today, is we tend to sit in academic rooms and discuss these topics rather than fuel them from below.
Oh, we're all tired. Leviathans and elephants in the room. For some reason, well, the reasons I can think of, as we were speaking today, I recall the conversation I had with a prominent journalist in Turkey. We're in a very fancy cafe in Bebek, and he is a prominent Jewish intellectual, Salih Ozel.
My friend.
And at that time he's saying, oh, he has a degree for Berkeley, so he knows a little bit about American politics. You know what's going on with the AKP? It's just like what happened in the United States. You know, you had excluded the southern states from mainstream American economic and political life. They come in comes their local religious stuff. It'll blow over, right? Well, the movement to integrate people who have been excluded, which has been a theme of mine today, is critical and fundamental, right? But in creating the movement, you create the Leviathan that takes on a life of its own, right?
And somebody else captures it.
Or the leaders take it for themselves. But we can think about Leviathans being created in the United States today too, but that's not our subject today, although maybe it should be in terms of universalisms. You know, the Iranian state became a Leviathan, right, after the revolution. It was captured by interests. And I'm moved to think, going back to basic politics, and that ideas are used and captured by political interests is one solution in Egypt. You know, the Chinese solution. Maybe we're not going to see anything happen until, because of sheer poverty in Egypt, the permission is given for a new bourgeoisie to grow, and then we see divisions and discomfort amongst those in power to create the power. I don't know, right? But I'm wondering if the answer lies less in isms and what we're thinking, and in more in terms of you know, the political interests and institutions that take ideas and run with them. And I'll end with this possibility, or just tantalizing possibility about universalism and the potential for unpacking powerful institutions that have divided these societies since the late 20th century. Could the devastation of the post-2011 moment, which destroyed the Muslim Brotherhood as an institution, right, leave space, right, for a different kind of thinking? And we'll go back to pre-Muslim Brotherhood, you know, because the founder of the Brotherhood claimed fraudulently that he was the heir of Rashid Rida, right? Rashid Rida never endorsed the Muslim Brotherhood, but he took over the magazine after Rashid Rida died and went with it. Rashid Rida published a very curious book that, not the Century Foundation, but Charles Crane, who was a friend of Woodrow Wilson, promised to distribute to intellectuals in America. He was so fascinated by it. It was the last book he ever published. And it was a vision because Europe was falling apart. This is the early 1930s. Fascism has reared its head. Liberalism is dead. You know, colonialists control the League of Nations by that point. There is no liberalism in the West. And he offered up Islam as the new Wilsonism, as universal. And not in a sectarian spirit that we might see today in the mouth of a Khomeini or you know, a fundamentalist, a narrow-minded, ill-educated, politically ambitious leader today, but in the mind of someone who had been invested in the old 19th century universals that we recognize had supported the liberal and secular idea at one point in the Middle East. To go back and unpack that moment and to recognize and give space to the possibility that Islam might return to being that universal.
For the hope of the 1930s, if we can just bring that back.
No, we don't want the 1930s. But yes, I end there.
Great. Just quickly, I'll say a few things about two of the questions. One is about Iran. Thanks for bringing that up. interesting. It's interesting that Iran is indeed a growingly secular society under an Islamic regime. And that's precisely a great reason to think that Islamic regimes are not great for Islam itself. Actually, some of the most anti-Islamic apostates from Islam come from Iran. And when you ask them, why did you convert from Islam? They say, Islam killed my father, tortured my... Well, he's speaking about the regime, actually. I mean, if you establish an authoritarian regime in the name of a religion, the opponents of that regime will go against that religion. And that's the worst thing you can do to a religion. That is even happening in Turkey today. There are a lot of Turkey observers who are saying that people who are critical of Erdogan are becoming fed up with Islam as well. Although these are Muslims, but I can't see it anymore because Islam is becoming identified with the government, which is making some people very happy and enthusiastic, but making a lot of people very unhappy and feeling persecuted. And those people, turn against religion. So that is a great reason to be arguing for a secular state in the name of religion. And I think Iran gives that stark example. Well, regarding the Quran, that's a huge thing, but I think you're referring to reformist arguments about the Quran. Yes, I mean, ultimately, if Islamism and Islamic classical Islam will be reformed, it will go back to Quran. I'll just say two things. Whether really some parts of the Quran are abrogated by other parts, which is one key issue there, or there are issues like whether the Quran is created or uncreated, for which people killed each other in the Middle East, Middle Ages, but we don't talk about that today. But there's a lot for that, but I think that's not the topic of this panel. Let's do a panel on that. How do we re-understand the Quran?
Maybe tomorrow we can reconvene. Thank you all so much.